It was one of those days that seemed to fall into place perfectly, when the world felt in harmony with itself. The early afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, casting intricate shadows on the ground below. There was a slight breeze that carried the scent of pine needles and earth, and as it whispered through the branches, I felt a familiar call, a quiet tug to venture into the woods. The woods had always been my retreat, a place of solitude and stillness where I could disappear from the busyness of life, where the demands of family and the responsibilities of marriage seemed to fade into the background. I knew every trail and tree, each secret nook where I could sit and lose myself in my thoughts. This afternoon, though, something felt different, as if the forest itself were inviting me in with a deeper purpose. As I walked along the well-trodden path, I noticed how the sounds of the house, familiar footsteps, distant voices, seemed to fade, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves underfoot and the occasional chirping of a bird hidden somewhere above. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and I welcomed the quiet with open arms. This was my sanctuary, a place where I could finally breathe. Today, I ventured deeper into the forest than usual, following an instinct rather than a plan. The tall trees formed a canopy above, shading me from the bright sun and lending the world a muted, green-tinted glow. It was the kind of day that felt endless, with time stretching out in front of me like a promise. After walking for what felt like hours, I found a small clearing with a fallen log to sit on. It seemed like the perfect spot, isolated, quiet, with only the soft sounds of nature around me. I sat down, letting the peacefulness of the woods wash over me, and for a moment I closed my eyes, relishing the solitude. It was just me and the silence, an entire world separated from the responsibilities waiting for me back home. Then I heard it. At first it was faint, so soft I could have imagined it. The sound of something moving, maybe a deer or a small animal rustling in the undergrowth. But as the seconds ticked by, the noise grew closer, steadier. My heartbeat quickened, though I couldn't say why. I wasn't afraid of the woods, but there was something about this moment that sent a shiver down my spine. Finally, I opened my eyes, and standing a short distance away, partially obscured by the trees, was Daniel, my stepson. He looked surprised to see me, but I was even more caught off guard. Daniel never came out this far into the woods. In fact, I rarely saw him venture into them at all. I opened my mouth to greet him, but no words came out. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other, the silence between us thick and charged, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Finally, I found my voice, though it felt foreign to me. "Daniel, I didn't expect anyone to follow me out here," I said, forcing a small smile. He didn't respond immediately, only shifted slightly, one hand resting against the rough bark of a nearby tree. There was something different in his expression, an intensity that I couldn't quite place. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said, his voice softer than usual, almost tentative. "I was out for a walk myself and saw you heading in this direction. Thought I'd catch up and see if you needed any company." His explanation seemed simple enough, but something in his gaze unsettled me. Daniel had always been polite, kind, and respectful, but we had never shared more than a cordial relationship. I'd come into his life when he was already grown, a young man trying to find his own way. We got along well enough, but there was a formality to our interactions, a certain distance that I'd always attributed to the nature of our relationship. Today, however, felt different, as if all that distance had suddenly melted away, leaving only the two of us alone in this secluded spot. "Well, you're welcome to stay," I said, patting the fallen log beside me. "The forest is better with company sometimes." He smiled, a slow, thoughtful expression that seemed to linger as he moved to sit next to me. The space between us felt small, much smaller than it should have, but I did my best to ignore the sensation. I didn't want to ruin the quiet moment with my overthinking. "So, you come out here a lot?" he asked, glancing around as though trying to take in the whole forest at once. I do, I replied, taking a breath to steady myself. This is my little escape. Whenever things get too loud or overwhelming, I come here to find some peace. It's been my place to think for years. He nodded, absorbing my words in silence. I found myself searching his face, noting how his features had matured, how the boyish look I remembered from when we'd first met had given way to the confidence of a man in his late 20s. There was a quiet intensity in his expression, a certain focus that made me feel self-conscious under his gaze. "It's beautiful here," he murmured, his voice almost a whisper. "I can see why you'd come here to get away." Our eyes met, and I felt a strange warmth spread through me, an inexplicable pull that left me feeling both curious and unsettled. I turned my gaze away, fixing it on a patch of sunlight that filtered through the branches above. This was Daniel, my stepson. It was strange to feel anything beyond familial affection for him, but I couldn't shake the thought that today felt different. We sat in silence for a while, letting the sounds of the forest fill the space between us. Birds called out from above, and a light breeze rustled the leaves, filling the air with a soft, natural melody. It felt surreal, as if we were in a world that belonged only to us, untouched by the realities of our everyday lives. Eventually, he broke the silence. "I've always admired how you handle everything," he said, his voice sincere. "With Dad's work keeping him away so much, you manage everything at home so effortlessly. I don't know if I ever told you that, but it's something I've noticed." I looked at him, taken aback by the unexpected compliment. "Thank you, Daniel. That means a lot," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I was moved, genuinely touched by his words. It was rare to hear such acknowledgement from him, and I hadn't realized how much I'd longed for it until that moment. He smiled, but this time, there was a trace of something else in his expression, something softer. I could feel the air around us thickening, charged with a tension that was as unfamiliar as it was undeniable. I wondered if he felt it too, this quiet pull that neither of us dared to name. "Do you ever feel like you're just playing a role?" he asked suddenly, his gaze focused on the ground. "Like everyone expects you to be one thing, but deep down you're someone else entirely?" His words struck a chord within me, touching on thoughts I'd rarely voiced, even to myself. "Yes," I admitted slowly, "I think we all do to some extent. It's easy to get lost in what everyone expects of you." He nodded, still looking down, his expression pensive. "I've been feeling that a lot lately," he said quietly, "like I'm living a life someone else planned for me. Sometimes I don't even know who I am beneath it all." I wanted to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort, but I hesitated. Instead, I let my words be my offering. "Daniel, finding yourself is a lifelong journey. You're still so young, you have time to figure it out, to be whoever you want to be." He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a depth I hadn't seen before. "Thank you," he said softly. "I'm glad you understand. I don't think I've ever been able to talk about this with anyone else." For a long moment, we sat there, simply looking at each other, as if we were seeing each other for the first time. The silence between us was heavy, yet comforting, a shared understanding that transcended words. And then, in a gesture that felt both innocent and intimate, he reached out, placing his hand on mine. I froze, my breath catching as I looked down at our hands, his fingers resting lightly over mine. It was a simple touch, yet it felt charged with an energy that I couldn't ignore. I glanced up at him, but his gaze remained on our hands, his expression unreadable. I knew I should pull my hand away, create some distance, but something kept me still. Perhaps it was the vulnerability in his expression, the quiet plea in his eyes that seemed to ask for understanding. I found myself unable to break the moment, trapped by a feeling that I couldn't quite name. Finally, he looked up, meeting my gaze, and I saw a flicker of hesitation, as though he were battling with something deep within himself. "You've always been there for me," he murmured, "even when I didn't deserve it." His words tugged at my heart, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a softness that blurred the lines between us. "Of course, Daniel. I've always cared about you," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, the world around us faded, leaving only the two of us in this secluded corner of the forest. It was as if we were suspended in time, caught in a moment that neither of us fully understood. And then, as quickly as it had begun, he let go of my hand, breaking the spell. The cool air rushed back in, grounding me, reminding me of the boundaries that lay between us. I took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of relief and confusion. Unsure of what to make of the moment we had just shared. "I should probably head back," I said, my voice unsteady. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, me too." We stood up, brushing leaves from our clothes, and without another word, we started the walk back in silence. The connection between us lingered, an unspoken understanding that neither of us dared to voice. As we approached the edge of the forest, I felt a pang of sadness, a sense of loss that I couldn't quite explain. Whatever had passed between us in that secluded spot would remain there, hidden in the depths of the woods, unspoken and unresolved. Yet, even as we walked back to the familiar world of our lives, I knew that the memory of that afternoon would stay with me, lingering in the quiet corners of my mind, a moment suspended in time that had changed something within me, something I couldn't ignore. Returning home, I tried to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over me, the lingering sense of that moment in the woods. The house was quiet, with only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards disturbing the silence. I went about my usual routines, tidying the kitchen, sorting the mail, preparing dinner for Robert and Daniel. But the air felt different, charged somehow, as if that brief encounter in the forest had altered the entire atmosphere around me. As I busied myself with cooking, my thoughts kept drifting back to Daniel. I could still feel the warmth of his hand on mine, the way his gaze had held a depth I hadn't seen before. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking it. After all, he was my stepson. Family. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the memory clung to me. A quiet whisper in the back of my mind. When Daniel entered the kitchen, the sound of his footsteps startled me out of my reverie. I turned to see him leaning casually against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. He gave me a small smile, but there was a look in his eyes that mirrored my own confusion. "Need any help?" he asked, nodding toward the stovetop. I hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, could you chop those vegetables?" I handed him a cutting board and a knife, and he stepped closer, his arm brushing lightly against mine as he took them from me. It was such a simple gesture, something that happened every day. But today it felt different. I was hyper-aware of the nearness of him, the scent of his cologne mingling with the aroma of herbs and spices. My heartbeat quickened, and I forced myself to focus on stirring the pot in front of me, trying to ignore the strange fluttering in my chest. We worked in silence, the only sound between us the steady rhythm of his knife against the cutting board. I kept my gaze fixed on the stove, unwilling to look up, afraid that if I met his eyes he might see the turmoil I was trying so hard to hide. "So, He finally broke the silence, his voice hesitant. "About earlier, in the woods." I felt my face flush, and I busied myself with wiping the counter to avoid his gaze. "Yes," I replied, my voice a bit too high. He hesitated, and I could sense him searching for the right words. "I didn't mean to make things awkward," he said slowly. I don't know. I guess I felt like we finally had a chance to talk." "It's fine," I replied quickly, trying to sound nonchalant. "I enjoyed it, really. I think it's good to talk about things." Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw a flicker of something, an unspoken understanding perhaps, that seemed to pass between us. But just as quickly as it appeared, he looked away, focusing on his task with a concentrated frown. That evening, we all sat down to dinner. The three of us, as we always did. Robert asked about my day, and I recounted the usual details, the errands, the walk in the woods, carefully leaving out any mention of Daniel's unexpected appearance. I could feel Daniel's gaze on me as I spoke, but I avoided looking in his direction, afraid that Robert might notice the tension simmering between us. After dinner, I excused myself, heading upstairs to take a bath, hoping that the warm water would wash away the confusion I couldn't seem to shake. But as I sank into the tub, I found myself replaying the events of the day over and over. The feeling of Daniel's hand on mine, the way he had looked at me with such intensity. I tried to brush it off, to convince myself that it was nothing more than a momentary lapse, but the memory refused to fade. The following days unfolded with a strange, unspoken tension that neither Daniel nor I dared to address. We danced around each other, exchanging polite greetings and brief smiles. But there was an undercurrent to every interaction, a lingering awareness that made even the simplest of gestures feel loaded. One afternoon, I was folding laundry in the living room when Daniel entered, taking a seat across from me. He seemed restless, his gaze wandering around the room before finally settling on me. "Can I ask you something?" he began, his tone unusually serious. "Of course," I replied, folding a shirt and setting it aside. He hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. "Do you ever wish things had turned out differently?" I looked at him, puzzled. "What do you mean?" He ran a hand through his hair, looking almost embarrassed. "I mean, with your life, do you ever feel like there's more out there? Something you missed out on?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't expected him to ask something so personal, so introspective. I glanced down at the laundry in my lap, feeling a pang of vulnerability. "I think everyone wonders that sometimes," I replied softly. "It's natural to look back and wonder about the choices we didn't make, the lives we might have lived." He nodded, as if my answer had struck a chord with him. "Yeah. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about the future, about what I want, and it's complicated." I set the laundry aside, focusing my attention on him fully. "It's good to think about those things, Daniel. You're young, you have time to figure out what you want." He gave a small, rueful smile. "I don't feel so young sometimes, especially when I think about the things that really matter." The weight of his words hung between us, and I felt a sudden urge to reach out, to offer some kind of reassurance. But I hesitated, keeping my hands folded in my lap. We sat in silence for a long moment, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I wanted to tell him that I understood, that I, too, felt the weight of choices and responsibilities pressing down on me. But I couldn't find the words, couldn't bring myself to break the silence. After a while, he stood up, giving me a small nod. "Thanks for listening," he said quietly, before heading out of the room. As he left, I felt a strange mixture of relief and longing. I had wanted to say more, to offer some kind of comfort, but the boundaries between us felt too fragile, too precarious. I reminded myself that he was my stepson, that any closeness between us had to remain within the confines of family. And yet, the memory of our conversation lingered, filling me with a quiet ache that I couldn't explain. The tension between us continued to simmer, a constant undercurrent that colored every interaction. I found myself looking forward to our brief moments together, the way he would linger in the kitchen after dinner, or how he would sit with me in the living room, asking about my day with a gentleness that felt almost intimate. I told myself it was nothing, that I was only imagining the closeness, but deep down, I knew that something had changed. One evening, as I was sitting alone in the living room, Daniel joined me, taking his usual seat across from me. We exchanged a few pleasantries, but there was a hesitation in his voice, a quiet intensity that I couldn't ignore. I've been thinking about our conversation, he said finally, his gaze fixed on me. About wanting more. I swallowed, my heart beginning to race. What about it? He looked away, as if gathering his thoughts. I don't know if I can keep pretending that everything is fine, that I'm happy with the way things are. His words sent a shiver through me, and I felt a strange sense of recognition, a shared understanding that left me feeling both comforted and unsettled. Daniel, I began, choosing my words carefully. It's okay to feel lost sometimes, to want something different. But we have to be careful. We have to make sure that the choices we make don't hurt the people we care about. He nodded slowly, his expression pensive. I know. I don't want to hurt anyone. Least of all, you. The sincerity in his voice struck me, and I felt my heart ache with an intensity that I couldn't explain. In that moment, I saw him not just as my stepson, but as a man struggling to find his place in the world, grappling with emotions that neither of us fully understood. We sat there in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between us. And though neither of us said it aloud, I knew that we were both caught in a quiet, impossible longing, one that would remain forever unspoken, bound by the limits of our lives and the choices we had made. In the days that followed, I tried to avoid spending too much time alone with Daniel. Each time we spoke, each moment we shared, I felt as though I was wading deeper into uncharted waters. Yet, despite my attempts to keep my distance, there was an undeniable pull between us, a magnetism that I couldn't seem to shake. Our encounters were filled with a tension that seemed to grow with each passing day, thickening the air between us in a way that left me breathless and unsettled. One afternoon, while Robert was out of town on a business trip, I found myself sitting in the kitchen, absent-mindedly leafing through an old photo album. I smiled as I flipped through the pages, looking at pictures from vacations, birthdays, and holidays over the years. I came across a photo of Daniel as a young teenager, his face full of energy and optimism. Seeing him like that reminded me of how much he had grown, how much he had changed since then. I was so absorbed in the memories that I didn't hear him enter the room. He appeared in the doorway, his eyes drawn to the album in my hands. "Going down memory lane?" he asked with a gentle smile, stepping closer to the table. I nodded, gesturing for him to sit beside me. "Yes, just reminiscing. Time flies, doesn't it?" He took a seat, leaning in to look at the photos. We laughed as we flipped through the pages, pointing out funny hairstyles and awkward teenage poses. The conversation felt light and easy, and for a moment I forgot about the tension that had been haunting us. But as the minutes passed, the familiar closeness began to creep back in, filling the small space between us. I could feel his arm brush against mine as he leaned closer, and I caught the faint scent of his cologne, a warm and inviting fragrance that stirred something deep within me. I tried to ignore it, to keep my focus on the photos, but it was impossible. My heartbeat quickened, and I glanced at him, only to find him looking back at me with that same intensity I'd seen in the woods. The world seemed to narrow to just the two of us, the rest of the house fading into the background. The air felt charged, and I could see something flicker in his eyes, an unspoken question, a silent plea that neither of us dared to voice. "Diana," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I looked away, my heart pounding, but he reached out, his hand gently covering mine. I felt a rush of warmth flood through me, and before I knew what I was doing, I turned back to him, drawn in by a force I couldn't resist. His gaze held me captive, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that left me breathless. "We shouldn't," I managed to whisper, though my voice lacked conviction. He nodded, but his hand remained on mine, his thumb gently stroking my knuckles. "I know," he murmured, his voice soft, almost pleading. "But I can't pretend that I don't feel this. That we don't feel this." His words hung in the air, heavy with a truth I couldn't deny. I wanted to pull away to break the spell, but something kept me rooted in place. I knew that crossing this line would change everything, that there would be no going back. Yet, despite the warnings in my mind, I felt myself leaning closer, drawn to him in a way that defied reason. Before I could second-guess myself, his hand moved to my face, his fingers tracing the curve of my jaw with a tenderness that left me breathless. He leaned in, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. I could feel his breath on my skin, warm and inviting, and every fiber of my being ached to close the distance between us. But just as our lips were about to meet, a wave of realization crashed over me, jolting me back to reality. I pulled away, my heart racing, and stood up, putting some distance between us. I can't, I stammered, my voice shaky. This isn't right. Daniel looked down, his expression pained, and I felt a pang of guilt twist in my chest. He didn't argue or try to convince me otherwise. Instead, he simply nodded, his voice barely a whisper. I understand. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotions, a mixture of longing and regret that hung heavy in the air. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the quiet resignation as he looked away, and it took every ounce of strength I had not to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort. I think we both need some space, I said softly, my voice trembling. He nodded again, his gaze fixed on the floor. You're right. I'm sorry. With that, he stood up and left the room, leaving me alone with a heart that felt as though it had been torn in two. I sank back into my chair, my mind racing, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling within me. I knew that what had almost happened was wrong, that it went against everything I had believed in. But there was a part of me, a quiet, hidden part, that ached with the memory of his touch, the warmth of his hand on mine. The way his gaze had made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I couldn't let this happen again. Whatever feelings had blossomed between us had to be buried, left in the past where they belonged. I couldn't allow myself to be drawn back into that dangerous pull, no matter how strong it felt. Yet as I sat there alone, the memory of his touch lingered, a bittersweet echo of something that could never be. That night, sleep escaped me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every moment from the kitchen. The closeness, the words we'd exchanged, the quiet vulnerability in Daniel's eyes. I felt torn between the guilt I knew I should feel and the ache that lingered within me, an emptiness I hadn't felt in years. It was as if he had awakened something in me, a forgotten part of myself that yearned for connection, understanding, and warmth. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with fragments of that afternoon. Daniel's hand on mine, the intensity in his gaze, the way he had whispered my name with such tenderness. I woke feeling both relieved and haunted, my heart heavy with the weight of what had almost happened. For the next few days, I avoided being alone with him, making sure our interactions were brief and polite. We kept things civil, hiding behind a mask of normalcy, but I could feel the tensions simmering beneath the surface, an unspoken understanding that neither of us dared to acknowledge. Each time we passed one another in the hallway or exchanged a casual greeting, I felt a surge of conflicting emotions, guilt, longing, confusion, all tangled together in a way that left me feeling lost. At dinner, Robert seemed oblivious to the change in atmosphere, his attention focused on his work. I envied his obliviousness, the ease with which he moved through life without noticing the turmoil beneath the surface. I wanted to talk to him, to confide in him, but I knew that some things were better left unsaid. I busied myself with household chores, throwing myself into tasks that didn't require much thought. Cleaning, organizing, anything to keep my mind occupied. Yet, no matter how much I tried to distract myself, my thoughts always drifted back to Daniel. The memory of his hand on mine, his whispered words, the warmth of his presence, all of it lingered in my mind like a shadow, haunting me in quiet moments when I thought I'd finally managed to move on. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the living room, I glanced up to see him standing in the doorway, his expression hesitant. My heart skipped a beat, and I forced myself to look away, pretending to be absorbed in the task at hand. "Diana," he began, his voice soft, "I think we need to talk." I froze, my fingers still clutching a towel, and looked up at him, my pulse racing. I knew this conversation was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier. He stepped into the room, taking a seat on the couch across from me, his gaze steady but filled with uncertainty. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us like a bridge we were both afraid to cross. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "For what happened. For putting you in that position. I shouldn't have let it go that far." I swallowed, feeling a lump form in my throat. "It's not just your fault, Daniel. I let it happen too. We both did." He nodded, his expression pained. "I don't want things to be awkward between us. You mean a lot to me, and I don't want to ruin that." I felt a surge of relief, tempered by sadness. "I don't either," I replied softly. "We have to move on. We have to put this behind us." He looked at me then, a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, in his eyes. "I understand. I'll do my best to keep my distance to make things easier for you." I nodded, feeling a bittersweet ache in my chest. I wanted to say something more, to tell him how much his words meant to me, but I knew that doing so would only complicate things further. So instead, I offered him a small smile, a silent gesture of understanding, and we sat in silence, letting the weight of our unspoken feelings settle between us. That night, I went to bed feeling a strange mix of emotions. I was relieved to have finally addressed the tension, but there was an emptiness that lingered, a quiet ache that reminded me of what I had almost let myself believe in, if only for a fleeting moment. The days that followed felt like a delicate balancing act. Daniel and I kept our interactions brief, exchanging polite greetings and focusing on our individual routines. I was grateful for the distance, but each time I saw him, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite define. An ache that reminded me of the connection we had shared, a connection that was now hidden behind a carefully constructed wall. In an attempt to reclaim some sense of normalcy, I threw myself into new activities, filling my days with hobbies I had once enjoyed but had neglected over the years. I took up painting again, setting up a small studio in the sunroom, and spent hours lost in the vibrant colors and textures, using art as a way to channel my emotions. I also started going for long walks, taking new trails through the woods, exploring parts of the forest I had never ventured into before. At night, I would sit alone in the living room, sipping tea and watching the shadows play across the walls, letting the silence wrap around me like a comforting blanket. I thought about Robert, about the life we had built together, and I realized that I had been so focused on the responsibilities of marriage that I had lost sight of myself somewhere along the way. I had let my own desires and dreams fade into the background, hiding behind the roles of wife, mother, and stepmother, without ever stopping to consider what I wanted. One evening, as I was sketching a landscape by the window, Robert came in and sat down beside me, watching me with a curious expression. "You've been spending a lot of time with your art lately," he remarked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I didn't know you still enjoyed it so much." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. I suppose I just forgot how much it meant to me. He reached out, gently placing a hand on my shoulder. "I'm glad you found something that makes you happy, Diana." His words touched me, and I felt a pang of guilt for the distance that had grown between us over the years. Robert was a good man, a devoted husband, and I realized that I owed it to him and to myself to give our relationship the attention it deserved. From that day on, I made a conscious effort to invest more time in our marriage. I initiated conversations, planned small outings, and did my best to bridge the gap that had formed between us. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I felt the weight of my unspoken feelings for Daniel pulling me back. But I reminded myself of the life I had chosen, of the love and stability that Robert offered. As the weeks passed, I found that my feelings for Daniel began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. The intensity of those days in the forest felt like a distant memory, a brief chapter in my life that had opened my eyes to parts of myself I had long ignored. I knew that our connection would always remain, a silent bond that neither of us would speak of. But I was determined to move forward, to find happiness in the life I had built. One evening, as I was returning from a walk in the woods, I saw Daniel waiting by the edge of the forest, his expression thoughtful. He looked up as I approached, giving me a small smile. "I thought I might find you here," he said, his voice gentle. I nodded, feeling a wave of nostalgia wash over me. "I come here to think," I replied softly. "It's become my place to find peace." We stood in silence for a moment, both of us looking out at the fading light filtering through the trees. There was a quiet understanding between us, a shared recognition of what had passed and what could never be. "I just wanted to thank you," he said finally, his voice steady, "for everything, for being there for me, even when I didn't deserve it." A lump formed in my throat, and I felt a swell of emotion rise within me. "Daniel, you don't have to thank me. Your family, I'll always be here for you." He smiled, a warmth in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. "I know, and I'll always be grateful for that." We exchanged a final glance, a silent farewell to the past, and I felt a sense of closure settle over me. Whatever had happened between us had been real, but it was also something that had shaped us, taught us both about the boundaries of love and the complexities of human connection. As the months turned into years, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Daniel moved out, finding his own path, and I continued to deepen my relationship with Robert, finding a renewed sense of commitment in the life we shared. The memory of those days in the woods remained, a quiet reminder of a chapter that had shaped me, but it no longer held the same weight. Instead, it became a part of my journey, a lesson in the importance of self-awareness, boundaries, and the power of choice. In my newfound solitude, I embraced my love for art, letting it become a part of my daily life. I found joy in the simple act of creating, in the colors and textures that allowed me to express the emotions I had kept hidden for so long. The forest became my muse, its beauty and mystery inspiring me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Looking back, I realized that my experience with Daniel had been a turning point, a catalyst for growth and self-discovery. It had shown me the importance of being true to myself, of honoring my own needs and desires, and of finding peace in the choices I had made. Life continued, filled with quiet moments of joy and reflection, and I found contentment in the life I had built, in the love I had nurtured, and in the person I had become. And though the memory of that time in the woods would always remain, it was now just that, a memory, a part of my past that had helped shape my future. In the end, I understood that love isn't always about holding on. Sometimes it's about letting go, finding peace in the journey, and learning to appreciate the beauty of the present. And for me, that was enough. Snowstorms have a way of trapping more than just people. They trap emotions, thoughts, and decisions you'd never dream of making otherwise. I learned that the hard way one frigid December night in the family cabin. Malcolm, my husband, had been called away for business at the last minute, leaving me to drive up to the cabin alone to check on things before the next snowfall. Nathan, his son from a previous marriage, volunteered to help, claiming he could use the fresh air. I didn't think much of it at the time. The storm hit earlier than expected, snow piling up so fast that leaving wasn't an option. The cabin's aging heater sputtered and died, leaving us with nothing but a dwindling fire for warmth. By the time night fell, the temperature inside was nearly as cold as it was outside. "We need to conserve heat," Nathan said, his breath visible in the dim light. Reluctantly, we piled blankets on the couch and huddled together. It was awkward at first, the proximity too close, too personal. But as the hours stretched on, the barriers between us seemed to melt, even as the snow piled higher outside. What began as a necessity soon felt like something else entirely. The snow fell relentlessly, the wind howling like a living thing outside the cabin walls. By nightfall, the old furnace had given up entirely, leaving Nathan and me bundled in layers as we tried to salvage what warmth we could. The fire crackled weakly in the stone hearth, but it wasn't enough. "I think it's getting colder in here," I said, pulling my blanket tighter around me. Nathan, seated across from me, nodded grimly. "It is. If the fire goes out, it'll be unbearable." His words sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. The snowstorm had arrived earlier and fiercer than any forecast predicted, leaving us stranded in the cabin. No power, no cell service, no escape. Nathan stood and began stacking more logs on the fire. "This'll help for a little while, but," he glanced back at me, "we need to stay warm. Body heat is the best way to do that." I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "You mean?" He shrugged, his expression earnest. "We'd share blankets, just until the worst of the storm passes." I wanted to refuse, to insist that we'd manage on our own. But as the cold seeped deeper into the cabin, I knew he was right. Survival didn't leave room for propriety. "All right," I said, my voice quiet. Nathan grabbed the thickest blankets he could find and draped them over the couch. I hesitated for a moment before joining him, settling awkwardly by his side. "This okay?" he asked, his tone careful. I nodded, avoiding his gaze. "It's fine." At first it was unbearable, physically and emotionally. I was acutely aware of every inch of space between us, or rather, the lack of it. But as the hours passed, the cold became our common enemy, forcing us to inch closer together. "Better?" Nathan asked softly, his breath visible in the dim light. "Yes," I said, though my voice wavered. The silence between us grew heavy, broken only by the wind outside. Finally, Nathan spoke. "This storm's worse than I thought it'd be," he said. I nodded. "It's been years since I've seen one like this." He leaned back against the couch, his expression thoughtful. "I used to love coming up here as a kid. My mom and I would stay for days sometimes. Just the two of us." His mention of his mother surprised me. Nathan rarely talked about her. "You must have been close," I said. "Yeah," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "She made this place feel like home." His words hit me harder than I expected. I had tried to fill that role in his life after marrying Malcolm, but I'd always felt like an outsider. "I'm sorry if I've never quite measured up," I said, my voice softer than I intended. Nathan turned to me, his expression startled. "What do you mean?" "I know I'm not her," I said awkwardly. "And I know it hasn't been easy for you adjusting to me being in your life." He shook his head. "You've been good to me, Olivia, better than I probably deserve." The sincerity in his voice made my breath catch. The hours crept by, and the fire began to die down again. Nathan shifted closer, pulling the blankets tighter around us. "You're freezing," he said, his voice low. "I'm fine," I replied, though my teeth chattered slightly. "Here," he said, wrapping an arm around me. I stiffened at first, but the warmth was undeniable. Gradually I allowed myself to relax, leaning into him as the cold receded. "You're like a human heater," I said, attempting to lighten the mood. He chuckled softly. "Guess I'm good for something." For a moment we sat in silence, the storm raging outside while the quiet intimacy of the moment enveloped us. As the night wore on, I found myself growing more comfortable in Nathan's presence. The barriers between us, the awkwardness, the formalities, seemed to dissolve in the face of our shared struggle. "Tell me something about yourself," he said suddenly. I glanced up at him, surprised. "Like what?" "Anything," he said. "Something I don't know." I hesitated before answering. "I used to want to be a painter," I said. "Before I married your father." "Why didn't you?" I shrugged. "Life got in the way. Malcolm had his career and I suppose I let my dreams fall by the wayside." Nathan's gaze softened. "You shouldn't have to give up what makes you happy." His words struck a chord in me, stirring something I hadn't felt in years. "What about you?" I asked, desperate to change the subject. "What did you want to be when you were younger?" He smiled faintly. An architect. I used to draw these elaborate plans for castles and mansions. My mom always said I had the imagination for it. What happened? He sighed. Life got in the way, I guess. His words echoed my own, and for a moment, I felt an unspoken bond between us. A shared sense of loss for the lives we'd once envisioned. When I woke the next morning, the storm had finally abated. Sunlight streamed through the frosted windows, casting a golden glow on the snow-covered landscape outside. Nathan was already up, stoking the fire back to life. He glanced over his shoulder as I sat up. "Morning," he said, his tone warm. "Morning," I replied, pulling the blanket tighter around me. The awkwardness from the night before had returned, but it was different now. Less about discomfort and more about the unspoken tension that had taken root between us. "We should be able to head out once the roads are cleared," he said, his voice casual. "Good," I said quickly, though a small part of me wasn't ready to leave the cocoon of the cabin. As we packed up later that day, I couldn't help but wonder if the storm had changed something between us, or if I was imagining it entirely. Returning home from the cabin, I thought the tension between Nathan and me would dissipate. The snowstorm had been an anomaly, a momentary lapse in boundaries born out of necessity. But as we unpacked our bags and settled back into the familiar surroundings of the house, I realized that something had shifted. Nathan avoided me at first. He'd retreat to his room or leave the house for long stretches, only speaking when spoken to. I told myself it was for the best, that this distance would bring us back to normalcy. But I couldn't ignore the way my stomach tightened every time I caught a glimpse of him in the hallway or heard his voice from the next room. One evening, as I was washing dishes in the kitchen, Nathan walked in. He hesitated in the doorway, as though debating whether to leave. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Yeah," he said, stepping further inside. "I just wanted to say thanks for, handling everything at the cabin." I turned off the water and dried my hands, surprised by his sudden sincerity. "You don't have to thank me. You were the one who kept us alive." He chuckled softly. "Still, I appreciate it." For a moment our eyes met, and I felt that familiar pull again, the unspoken connection that neither of us seemed able to ignore. The turning point came late one night. I couldn't sleep. Restless with thoughts I didn't want to acknowledge, I wandered downstairs intending to make tea, only to find Nathan sitting in the dimly lit living room, a book in his hands. "You're up late," I said, startled. He looked up, his expression softening when he saw me. "Couldn't sleep?" "Me neither," I admitted, sitting on the couch across from him. For a while, we sat in comfortable silence, the ticking of the clock the only sound in the room. Finally, Nathan closed his book and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice hesitant. "Of course," I replied. "At the cabin, did it feel different to you?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. My heart raced as I considered my answer. "Yes," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I thought it was just me." "It wasn't," I said. The silence that followed was deafening, but neither of us moved to fill it. Eventually, Nathan stood and crossed the room, sitting beside me. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he said, "but I can't stop thinking about it." "Me neither," I admitted, my voice trembling. When he leaned in, I didn't stop him. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. But, as it deepened, I knew we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. In the days that followed, we tried to avoid each other, as though pretending nothing had happened would erase the memory of that night. But the pull between us was too strong. One evening, after Malcolm had left for a week-long business trip, Nathan and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen again. He was pouring a glass of water when I walked in, and the air between us crackled with tension. "We can't keep doing this," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Why not?" he asked, setting the glass down and stepping closer. "No one has to know." "It's not that simple," I said, my back pressing against the counter as he approached. "It could be," he murmured, his hand brushing mine. When his lips met mine, all my reservations melted away, replaced by a desire I couldn't deny. As our relationship deepened, it became harder to keep our secret. I found myself hyper-aware of the people around us, of the way Clara, my best friend, watched me during our weekly coffee dates, or the way Greg, Malcolm's business partner, seemed to linger too long in conversations with Nathan. "You seem different lately," Clara said one morning as we sipped our lattes. "Different how?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "Happier," she said, her tone curious. "More alive." I laughed nervously. "Maybe I've just been getting more sleep. Or maybe there's something, or someone, you're not telling me about," she teased, her smile playful but her eyes sharp. Her words stayed with me, a reminder of how thin the veil of secrecy between Nathan and me really was. Greg had always been nosy, but his interest in Nathan seemed to intensify after Malcolm mentioned that his son was staying with us. One evening, during a dinner party at our house, Greg cornered Nathan in the kitchen. "So," Greg said, swirling his wine glass, "what's it like staying here with Olivia?" Nathan stiffened, glancing at me across the room. "It's fine," he said cautiously. "Just fine?" Greg pressed, his tone light but probing. "She's a lovely woman, isn't she?" Nathan's jaw tightened. "She is." Greg smirked, clearly enjoying the discomfort he was causing. "I hope you're not giving her too much trouble." Nathan's eyes narrowed, and I stepped in before the conversation could escalate. "Greg, do you mind helping Malcolm in the dining room?" I asked, keeping my tone polite but firm. "Of course," Greg said, flashing me a knowing smile before leaving the room. "What was that about?" I asked Nathan once we were alone. "Nothing," he said, though his expression told a different story. He's just being Greg. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg suspected more than he let on. As our relationship progressed, the risks we were taking became harder to ignore. Nathan and I found ourselves sneaking around more frequently, stealing moments in the early mornings or late at night. One evening, as we sat together in the garden, Nathan turned to me, his expression serious. "What are we doing, Olivia?" he asked. I sighed, staring at the moonlit flowers. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't want to hurt you," he said. "You're not," I said quickly. "But it's complicated." He reached for my hand, his grip firm. "I'm willing to take the risk if you are." His words sent a thrill through me, but also a pang of fear. I knew the stakes, but I couldn't bring myself to walk away. The secret between Nathan and me began to feel like a double life. By day, we went through the motions of a normal household. Malcolm was as oblivious as ever, consumed by his work and social commitments. At night, Nathan and I tiptoed around each other, stealing moments that felt like stolen treasure. The thrill was undeniable, but so was the risk. Each shared glance or accidental touch carried the weight of 1,000 questions. Who would notice? Who would tell? And what would happen when they did? One afternoon, while Malcolm was at work, Nathan and I found ourselves alone in the living room. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, bathing everything in a soft, golden glow. I sat on the couch, my book forgotten, as Nathan leaned against the armrest beside me, his hand brushing mine. "Someone might come home," I whispered, glancing nervously at the door. "Your friend Clara texted. She's taking Malcolm to that fundraiser," Nathan replied, his voice low and confident. That assurance was enough to make me let my guard down, if only for a moment. But as Nathan leaned closer, the sound of the front door opening sent a jolt of panic through me. "Olivia? Nathan?" Malcolm's voice called. We scrambled apart, my heart pounding as Malcolm walked into the room. He stopped in the doorway, his brow furrowing slightly. "What's going on in here?" he asked, his gaze darting between us. "Just reading," I said quickly, holding up my book as though it could shield me. Nathan nodded, his expression calm. I was just about to head out. Malcolm stared at us for a moment longer, then shrugged. "All right, I thought I heard voices." He left the room, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "That was close," I whispered to Nathan once Malcolm was gone. "Too close," he agreed, his jaw tight. As if the situation wasn't complicated enough, Sabrina, Nathan's ex-girlfriend, reappeared. She showed up unannounced one evening, her bright smile and overly familiar demeanor instantly setting me on edge. "Hey, Nate," she said, brushing past me as though I didn't exist. "Thought I'd swing by and catch up." Nathan stiffened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you doing here, Sabrina?" "Just missed you," she said with a playful shrug. "Is that a crime?" I hovered awkwardly in the kitchen, listening to their conversation with growing unease. "You shouldn't be here." Nathan said finally, his tone firm. Why not? Sabrina asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Got something to hide? Their conversation grew quieter after that, but her presence lingered like a dark cloud over the house. Meanwhile, Clara's curiosity about my behavior had turned into outright suspicion. You've been distracted lately, she said during one of our coffee dates. I've just had a lot on my plate, I replied, trying to sound casual. Clara tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. It's not just that, Olivia. You seem different, happier maybe, but also more tense. Her words struck a nerve, but I forced a laugh. You're imagining things. Am I? She asked, her tone skeptical. Greg's meddling took a darker turn when he overheard a snippet of conversation he wasn't meant to. Nathan and I had been talking in hushed tones in the garden one evening, thinking we were alone. You have to be careful, I said, my voice urgent. I know. Nathan replied, his hand brushing mine. Greg's voice cut through the air like a knife. Careful about what? We both froze, turning to see him standing at the edge of the patio, his arms crossed and a sly smile on his face. Greg, I said, forcing a smile. We didn't see you there. Clearly, he replied, his gaze darting between us. What are you two whispering about? Nothing important, Nathan said quickly, his tone sharp. Greg's smile widened. You two have been spending a lot of time together lately. Makes a person wonder. I felt a chill run down my spine as he walked away. His words heavy with implication. The tension in the house reached a boiling point as Malcolm began noticing the subtle changes in my behavior. Is something going on with you? He asked one evening as we sat in the living room. What do you mean? I asked, my heart racing. You've been distracted, he said, his brow furrowing. And Nathan's been acting strange too. Is there something I should know? I forced a smile, shaking my head. No, Malcolm. Everything's fine. But I could see the doubt in his eyes, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he started digging deeper. The strain of keeping our secret took its toll on my relationship with Nathan as well. One evening, after another close call, we found ourselves arguing in the kitchen. This is getting too dangerous, I said, my voice rising. Someone's going to figure it out. We can handle it, Nathan said, his tone firm. Can we? I countered, my frustration boiling over. Because it feels like everything is falling apart. Nathan stepped closer, his expression softening. I don't want to lose you, Olivia. His words cut through my anger, leaving me breathless. I don't want to lose you either, I admitted. But even as we reconciled, I couldn't shake the feeling that our time was running out. The moment that nearly unraveled everything came when Malcolm returned home unexpectedly during one of our stolen moments. Nathan and I had been in the garden, our voices low as we talked about our next steps. We have to stop this, I said, my voice trembling. Do you really want to? Nathan asked, his eyes searching mine. Before I could answer, the sound of Malcolm's voice sent us scrambling apart. What's going on out here? He asked, his tone suspicious. Just getting some air, I said quickly, forcing a smile. Malcolm's gaze lingered on us for a moment too long before he nodded and walked back inside. That was too close, I whispered to Nathan once Malcolm was out of earshot. I know, he said, his expression grim. Greg wasn't the type to keep quiet when he thought he had an advantage. The day after our garden encounter, he arrived at the house unannounced, his demeanor smug as he greeted Malcolm with a hearty handshake. I watched from the kitchen, my stomach sinking as Greg's gaze flicked to me, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Olivia, he said, his tone dripping with feigned warmth. Good to see you. And you, I replied, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. Greg wasted no time before steering the conversation to Nathan. Where's your stepson? He's quite the conversationalist these days. Always so attentive. Malcolm raised an eyebrow, glancing between Greg and me. He's out running errands, I said quickly, but the tension in my voice must have been noticeable. Greg smirked. Busy young man. I wonder what keeps him so occupied. I excused myself from the room before my composure cracked, retreating upstairs where I could think. Greg's words were a clear warning, and I knew he was waiting for the right moment to strike. Later that evening, Greg cornered Nathan in the driveway as he returned home. I watched from the window, my heart racing as their voices rose. I know what you're up to, Greg said, his tone sharp. Nathan crossed his arms, his stance defiant. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I think you do, Greg replied, stepping closer. You and Olivia, the looks, the whispers, do you really think no one's noticed? Nathan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Greg leaned in, his voice dropping. Here's the deal, kid. You leave town and I keep this to myself. Stay, and I'll make sure Malcolm knows everything. Nathan didn't flinch. You think you can scare me? Greg smirked. I don't have to. The truth will do that for me. When Nathan told me what had happened, my first instinct was panic. He'll tell Malcolm, I said, pacing the living room. Not if I leave, Nathan said quietly. No, I said firmly, turning to face him. We'll find another way. Nathan shook his head. Olivia, this isn't just about us anymore. If he tells Malcolm, it'll ruin everything. I felt tears sting my eyes as I considered the weight of his words. What are you saying? I'm saying maybe it's time to end this, he said, his voice trembling. His words felt like a knife to the chest, but I knew he was right. The longer we continued, the more likely it was that everything would come crashing down. Just as I was grappling with the thought of losing Nathan, Clara showed up unexpectedly. She had called earlier, sensing something was wrong, and when I didn't pick up, she came to the house. Olivia, she said, her tone sharp as she stepped inside. We need to talk. Clara, now isn't a good time, I said, trying to usher her out. Too bad, she said, crossing her arms. You've been acting strange for weeks, and I'm done pretending not to notice. Her persistence cracked the fragile dam I'd been holding together, and before I knew it, the truth came spilling out. Oh my God, Clara whispered, her eyes wide as she sank onto the couch. You and Nathan? It's not what you think, I said quickly, though even I didn't believe my own words. It doesn't matter what I think, Clara said, her voice shaking. What matters is what happens next. Do you have any idea what you're risking? I buried my face in my hands, unable to answer. True to his word, Greg didn't wait long to make his move. The following evening, he showed up at the house during dinner, his expression smug as he greeted Malcolm. Greg? Malcolm said, surprised. What brings you by? Oh, just thought I'd check in, Greg said, his eyes darting to Nathan and me. I've been noticing some interesting dynamics around here lately. My stomach churned as Greg's words hung in the air, but Malcolm, oblivious, laughed. Greg, you've always been one for gossip. Come on, let's have a drink. As Malcolm led Greg to the study, I turned to Nathan, my voice low. We're running out of time. I know, he said, his jaw clenched. That night, Nathan came to me with a plan. I'll talk to Greg, he said, his voice resolute. One last time. No, I said, panic rising. You can't trust him. I'm not asking for his trust, Nathan replied, but if I don't do something, he'll ruin everything. Despite my protests, Nathan left the house later that night, determined to put an end to Greg's threats. Nathan met Greg at a quiet bar on the outskirts of town, the dim lighting and low hum of conversation providing a semblance of privacy. This is your last chance, Greg said as he sipped his drink. Leave town, or I'll destroy both of you. Nathan leaned forward, his expression cold. You think you can control me? Or Olivia? You're pathetic. Greg's smirk faltered. Careful, kid. You don't want to make an enemy of me. Nathan didn't back down. You already are. Greg stormed out of the bar, his threats lingering in the air. When Nathan returned home, his face was pale but determined. It's done, he said. What did you do? I asked, fear gripping me. Nothing illegal, he replied, though his tone was evasive. But the peace was short-lived. The next morning, Malcolm received an anonymous email, one that included enough damning information to unravel everything. It was early morning when Malcolm stormed into the kitchen, his phone gripped tightly in one hand. His face was pale with fury, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might crack. Olivia! He barked, slamming the phone onto the counter. What the hell is this? I froze, my eyes darting to the phone. On the screen was an email, its subject line ominous, the truth about your wife and your son. Below it was a series of photos, grainy but unmistakable, capturing stolen moments between Nathan and me. The captions were worse, each one dripping with venom and accusation. This has to be a mistake, I stammered, but my voice betrayed me. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. Don't insult my intelligence, Olivia. I've been suspicious for weeks, and now I know why. Nathan entered the room then, his face going pale as he took in the scene. What's going on? He asked, his voice cautious. Malcolm turned on him, his anger shifting like a thunderstorm. You know damn well what's going on. You've been sneaking around with my wife. My wife, Nathan. Nathan stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Malcolm, just listen. Don't you dare tell me to listen. Malcolm shouted, his voice cracking. I welcomed you into my home, and this is how you repay me? It's not as simple as you think, Nathan said, his voice steady despite the chaos. Not as simple? Malcolm laughed bitterly. You seduced her, didn't you? Manipulated her the way you manipulate everyone else. That's not what happened, I said, my voice trembling. Malcolm, please, let's talk about this. There's nothing to talk about, he said coldly. I trusted you, Olivia. I gave you everything, and you threw it away for him. The words cut deep, but before I could respond, Malcolm turned to Nathan again. You're no son of mine. Pack your things and get out of my house. Before Nathan could respond, the doorbell rang. I flinched at the sound, dreading what fresh disaster it might bring. When Malcolm opened the door, Sabrina stood on the porch, her expression smug. Sabrina, Nathan said, his voice laced with disbelief. What are you doing here? I came to deliver the rest of the truth, she said, brushing past Malcolm into the house. What truth? Malcolm demanded, his tone sharp. Sabrina pulled out her phone, holding it up for everyone to see. I think you'll want to hear this, she said, playing an audio recording. Nathan's voice crackled through the speaker, his tone low and urgent. Greg needs to back off. If he doesn't, I'll make sure he regrets it. The room fell silent as the recording ended. What is that supposed to mean? Malcolm asked, his gaze locking onto Nathan. It's not what it sounds like, Nathan said quickly. Sabrina smirked. Oh, I think it's exactly what it sounds like. Nathan's been playing games, Malcolm, with Greg, with Olivia, with everyone. Malcolm turned to me, his eyes filled with betrayal. Is this true? Did you know about this? I didn't, I said, though the words felt hollow. Don't lie to me, Olivia, he said, his voice shaking. I don't even know who you are anymore. Nathan stepped between us. Leave her out of this, he said firmly. This is all about her, Malcolm snapped. You don't think I see that? Everything you've done has been for her. Nathan's jaw tightened. Maybe it has. But you drove her to it, Malcolm. You treated her like an afterthought while you chased your career. Don't you dare lecture me about my marriage, Malcolm growled. The tension in the room was suffocating, and for a moment I thought someone might actually throw a punch. As if on cue, Greg's arrival shattered whatever fragile control remained. He burst into the house without knocking, his expression wild. What the hell is going on here? Malcolm demanded. Greg pointed at Nathan. He threatened me. Said he'd ruin me if I didn't keep my mouth shut. Nathan stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. You've been trying to blackmail us, Greg. Don't act like the victim. Blackmail? Malcolm repeated, his face twisting with disbelief. Yeah, Greg said, his tone venomous. Because you deserve to know the truth about what's been going on under your roof. The argument spiraled out of control, voices overlapping as accusations flew. Finally, Malcolm slammed his fist onto the counter, silencing everyone. Enough, he shouted. I don't care who started what. I want all of you out of my house, now. I felt my stomach drop. Malcolm, please. Save it, he said coldly. I'll have the divorce papers ready by the end of the week. Nathan's face darkened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned to me, his eyes filled with regret. I'll wait for you outside, he said softly before leaving the room. As I stood on the porch watching Nathan load his car, I felt an ache deep in my chest. This wasn't how I wanted it to end, I said quietly. He turned to me, his expression pained. It doesn't have to end. Come with me. I hesitated, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I can't, I said finally, tears spilling down my cheeks. I've already lost too much. Nathan nodded, his jaw tightening. I understand. Without another word, he got into his car and drove away, leaving me standing in the cold. In the days that followed, the fallout from the affair consumed my life. Clara called repeatedly, her concern evident, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. Malcolm moved into a hotel, leaving the house eerily empty. I spent my nights staring at the garden, replaying every choice that had led me here. The passion, the risks, the lies, they had all come at a cost I wasn't sure I could bear. And yet, a part of me couldn't regret it. For the first time in years, I had felt alive, even if it had all ended in ruin.